Shaquille O'Neal never expected a routine morning to change his life. But when he saw Henry Calloway, a 90-year-old man struggling to push shopping carts just to afford food, he knew something wasn't right. What started as curiosity turned into a shocking discovery. Henry wasn't just any old man. He was a forgotten professor, a man erased by corruption, forced into poverty by the very system he tried to change. Shaq couldn't let it go. As he dug deeper, he uncovered a web of betrayal, stolen legacies, and secrets powerful men would do anything to keep buried. But justice has a way of finding the light, and Shaq was about to do the unthinkable. What did Shaq uncover? What truth had been hidden for decades? And how did this one act of kindness turn into a battle against an entire institution? This is the story they never wanted you to hear. Watch now, because some stories deserve to be told. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun hung bright over the city, its golden hue stretching across the skyline, as life buzzed below. The streets pulsed with movement, horns honking, pedestrians weaving through crosswalks, and baristas calling out coffee orders. It was the kind of day that made the city feel alive, electric, like a living, breathing organism. And in the middle of it all, Shaquille O'Neal, better known as Big Shaq, moved through his routine like clockwork. Shaq loved mornings. They were his time to blend in, to just be another guy grabbing coffee, nodding at strangers, and soaking in the rhythm of the world around him. Despite his towering 7'1" frame and the fact that almost everyone recognized him, he carried himself with a laid-back humility. He wasn't just a millionaire, a former NBA legend, or a media personality. He was a man who believed in kindness, respect, and using his blessings to lift others up. After finishing his workout, Shaq drove his black SUV toward his usual breakfast spot, a small, unassuming diner he had been going to for years. The best pancakes in town. According to him, he liked the predictability of it, the familiar faces, the way the old cook always nodded at him like he was just another regular. But today something shifted. As he pulled into the parking lot of the grocery store across the street, Shaq's eyes caught something that made his chest tighten. Near the front entrance, where shopping carts were usually stacked neatly, an old man, thin, frail, and hunched over, was struggling to push a heavy line of carts back into place. The man's body shook from the effort, his hands gripping the cold metal handles with visible strain. The wind tugged at his oversized jacket, making him look even smaller, like a leaf barely holding onto a branch in a storm. Shaq turned off his car, his gaze locked on the old man. Something about him didn't sit right. The grocery store had younger employees, stronger workers. Why was this elderly man doing such a grueling task? He watched as a group of teenagers walked by, laughing and joking, completely unaware of the man's struggle. A younger store employee passed him without a glance, typing away on his phone. It was as if the old man was invisible, just another fixture in the background of the city. Shaq didn't like that. He stepped out of his car, moving closer, his size impossible to ignore. But the old man didn't look up. He just kept pushing, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. Then, for just a second, their eyes met. Shaq had seen that look before, a quiet dignity wrapped in exhaustion, a kind of pride that refused pity, but a pain that couldn't be hidden. It hit him harder than expected, like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about pushing carts. This was about something bigger. Shaq sat in his car longer than usual, hands resting on the wheel, staring out at nothing in particular. The image of the old man gripping those shopping carts, his fragile body leaning into the weight of them, refused to fade. It wasn't just a physical struggle, it was the look in his eyes, that quiet resolve, that undeniable exhaustion hidden beneath a layer of dignity. The thought followed Shaq into the diner. He went through the motions, ordering his usual pancakes, nodding at the waitress, sipping his orange juice. But his mind wasn't there. The chatter of the other customers, the clinking of plates, the hum of the coffee machine, it all faded into the background. His thoughts were somewhere else.
Why was a 90-year-old man working like that? Was he really alone? No family? No one to help him? Or was he too proud to ask?
Shaq had seen it before. Pride was a tricky thing. It could keep a man standing tall when everything else was falling apart. But at what cost? He cut into his pancakes, but he wasn't hungry. The memory of his mother's voice slipped into his mind, clear as day, like she was sitting right across from him.
You don't just walk past people, son. You see them.
Shaq leaned back, staring at his plate. Lucille O'Neal had raised him on a foundation of kindness and awareness. She taught him that strength wasn't just in muscles. It was in how you carried the burdens of others when they couldn't carry them alone. And now, no matter how successful he became, no matter how many businesses, endorsements, or championships he collected, those lessons never left him. He closed his eyes, and suddenly, he wasn't in the diner anymore. Shaq was 10 years old, standing outside a grocery store, much like this one, gripping his mother's hand. It was summer, the heat rolling off the pavement in waves. Across the parking lot, a homeless man sat against a wall, knees pulled to his chest, head down. His clothes were torn, his shoes barely holding together. People walked past him without a second glance. Some even stepped a little farther away, as if poverty was contagious. Shaq remembered tugging on his mother's hand, pointing at the man. "Mama, why won't anyone help him?" Lucille knelt beside him, brushing a hand over his short hair. "Not everyone sees people the way they should, baby. But we do." She walked straight into the store, bought a sandwich and a cold bottle of water, and placed them gently beside the man. She didn't say much, just smiled and gave him a moment of acknowledgement. That was all it took. Shaq remembered the way the man had lifted his head, eyes filled with something fragile, something raw, gratitude, disbelief, the kind of look that stays with you forever. Now, sitting in the diner, staring at his untouched pancakes, Shaq realized something. This wasn't about charity. This was about humanity. He threw a few bills on the table and left, the morning air cool against his skin. His SUV sat waiting, but he hesitated before getting in. His instinct was screaming at him, that feeling in his gut that never steered him wrong. The old man, the carts, the tired eyes. It wasn't just some passing moment. It mattered. But what could he do? Just hand him money? That wasn't the answer. He knew that much. He climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel, frustration bubbling up. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe the old man wanted to work. Maybe it wasn't his business. But that felt like an excuse. As he drove through the city, his mind kept circling back. Every red light, every turn, every glance in the rearview mirror. It was like the old man was right there, sitting beside him, waiting for Shaq to figure it out. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he already knew. He couldn't just let this go. Shaq didn't sleep well that night. No matter how many times he tossed or turned, the image of the old man pushing those heavy carts stayed with him. It gnawed at his thoughts, burrowed into his chest like an ache he couldn't shake. By morning, he knew there was only one thing to do. He had to go back. The grocery store parking lot was already alive with movement by the time Shaq pulled in. A woman pushed a stroller past the entrance. A man loaded groceries into his trunk. A teenager in a store apron gathered loose carts near the sidewalk. But Shaq wasn't looking for them. He scanned the lot until his eyes landed on the familiar hunched figure near the cart bay. There he was. The same old man, wrapped in the same oversized jacket, hands gripping the metal handle of a long line of carts, as he struggled to push them into place. Shaq stepped out of his SUV, crossing the lot with long, steady strides. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he needed answers. The old man didn't notice him at first. He was too focused, too caught up in the simple act of trying to keep moving forward. Shaq stopped a few feet away. "Morning, big man." The old man barely glanced up, his weathered face lined with years of exhaustion. "Morning," he muttered, still pushing the carts forward inch by inch. Shaq watched for a second before speaking again. "You work here?" That got his attention. The man straightened slightly, wiping his hands on his faded jeans before turning toward Shaq. Now that he was up close, Shaq could see the details the distance had hidden. The deep wrinkles around his eyes, the thinning gray hair, the sunken cheeks that spoke of skipped meals. "You a cop or something?" the old man asked, his voice carrying a mix of suspicion and amusement. Shaq chuckled. "Nah, man, just curious." He extended a massive hand. Shaq. The old man eyed him for a second before shaking his hand. Henry Calloway." Henry pulled a crumpled handkerchief from his jacket pocket and dabbed his forehead before sighing. "I know what you're thinking. I'm too old for this kind of work. Hell, I tell myself that every damn morning." Shaq crossed his arms. "So why do it?" Henry gave a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Because the fridge don't fill itself, and the doctors sure don't give out free medicine." The words hit harder than expected. Henry leaned against the cart rack, studying Shaq for a long moment. "Let me guess. You see an old man struggling, and you think, why ain't somebody taking care of him?" His lips pressed into a thin line, Ain't nobody left to do that, son. It's just me. Shaq felt something tighten in his chest. No family? Henry exhaled, slowly. Had a wife once. Passed a long time ago. Had a son too. But life don't always go the way you want it to. He paused, his fingers gripping the cart handle a little tighter. Ain't seen him in over 20 years. Shaq knew better than to push. Some wounds didn't need to be reopened just yet. What about retirement? Shaq asked carefully. Henry gave a dry chuckle. Retirement? He shook his head. You gotta have a retirement fund to retire. The words stung more than they should have. Shaq had spent millions on things he didn't even think twice about. Cars, houses, business ventures, and here was a man, old enough to be his grandfather, working just to eat. Shaq hesitated before asking his next question. What did you do before this? Henry's jaw tightened. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, not just sadness but something deeper. A wound that had never healed. I was a professor, Henry finally said, his voice quieter now. Taught history for damn near 40 years. Shaq blinked. A professor? He hadn't expected that. What happened? Henry let out a slow breath, looking past Shaq, like he was staring at something only he could see. University let me go. Said they didn't have the budget for me anymore. But that wasn't the real reason. Shaq frowned. What was? Henry's eyes met his. And for the first time there was no amusement. No lightness. Just the weight of decades of injustice. Because I didn't stay quiet when I was supposed to. Henry looked away, his fingers tracing the edge of the cart handle absent-mindedly. I spoke up about things they didn't like. Racism, inequality, the way the system was rigged for some and not for others. He let out a hollow laugh. Back then, a black professor who didn't keep his head down, that wasn't something they wanted sticking around. Shaq felt his blood run cold. Henry shrugged. One day they told me I was no longer needed. Gave me a small severance check, just enough to make me think I'd be okay for a while. But you know how it goes. Bills don't stop just 'cause your paycheck does. Shaq's jaw clenched. Henry sighed. I tried to fight it. Took him to court, but they had more money. Better lawyers. I lost everything in the process. Savings, gone. Pension, wiped out in legal fees. By the time I realized I wasn't getting justice, it was too late. Shaq exhaled slowly, trying to process what he was hearing. This wasn't just an old man working because he wanted to. This was a man who had been robbed of everything. Henry straightened up, as if shaking off the weight of the past. But you want to know the real reason? I'm out here pushing these carts. He met Shaq's eyes, his voice steady. Because I ain't never been the kind of man to beg, and I sure as hell ain't startin' now. Shaq respected that, but respect didn't change the fact that this wasn't right. Henry wiped his hands on his jeans again. Alright, enough of my sob story. You need help finding something in the store. Shaq shook his head slowly. Nah, man. I was just curious. Henry chuckled. Well, now you know. Ain't no mystery left. But that wasn't true. There was still one mystery left. As Shaq watched Henry push another row of carts forward, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Henry had accepted his fate. He had made peace with his struggle. But that didn't mean Shaq had to. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Henry's story than he was letting on. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself, it wasn't just exhaustion, it was defiance. A man beaten down but unwilling to break. A man who had spent his life fighting battles no one cared to see. After their conversation at the grocery store, Shaq sat in his car, watching Henry push carts with the same quiet determination. The man should have been enjoying his golden years, not struggling under the weight of survival. Shaq had seen a lot in his life. Poverty, hardship, people getting the short end of the stick. But something about this cut deeper. Henry wasn't just a man down on his luck. He was a man who had been robbed. Shaq checked the time. The sun had started its slow descent, stretching shadows across the pavement. Then he saw it. Henry untied his work apron, folded it neatly, and tucked it under his arm. His shift was over. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, glanced toward the city streets, and started walking. No car. No ride home. Just him and his feet against the pavement. Shaq didn't think twice. He started his SUV, waited a few seconds, then eased onto the road, keeping a careful distance. He was going to find out the truth. Henry walked with a steady, familiar rhythm, as if he had made this same tiring trek every night for years. He didn't stop to chat with anyone, didn't slow down, didn't hesitate. Shaq followed from a distance, watching as Henry moved past storefronts, under flickering streetlights, through quieter parts of the city where buildings grew older and sidewalks cracked under the weight of time. Shaq expected him to turn toward a small house, maybe a senior living complex. But Henry kept walking, deeper into the city, toward a part of town Shaq recognized for all the wrong reasons. Finally, Henry stopped in front of a rundown brick building, its once white walls stained with years of neglect. The front steps were cracked, the windows lined with rusting bars. A sagging awning above the entrance barely clung to its last bit of fabric. Shaq pulled his car into a side street, watching as Henry fished out a key from his pocket and let himself inside. This was where he lived? This wasn't a home. It was a forgotten corner of the city, a place where people were left to fade away. Shaq sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the building like it might somehow offer an explanation. Henry Calloway had been a professor, a man who had dedicated his life to educating others. And now he was living in a place that looked more like a relic of abandonment than a home. Shaq wasn't about to let this go. The next morning he made a few calls. He still had connections, people who could dig up information most folks couldn't. It took a few hours, but when the first report came in, Shaq's stomach tightened. Henry Calloway wasn't just any professor. He had been one of the most respected historians in his field. A man who had written books, led groundbreaking research, taught generations of students. His name should have been remembered. But something had happened. Shaq scrolled through the report, his eyes narrowing. Henry had been forced out of his position at the university under the excuse of budget cuts. But the more Shaq read, the clearer the truth became. He had been silenced. He had been vocal about racism in academia, about discrimination in hiring, about the lack of opportunities for black scholars. He had written articles, spoken at conferences, pushed for change, and then he was gone. Shaq clenched his jaw. They didn't just fire him, they erased him. The university had buried his work, pulled his name from research papers, made sure his legacy faded into the background. And Henry? Henry had spent years fighting for justice until the legal fees drained him of everything. Now he was living in a crumbling building, pushing carts to survive, while the people who stole his career sat in air-conditioned offices, pretending he never existed. Shaq leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't just about money. This was about justice. And he wasn't about to let this stand. Shaq wasn't the type to let things slide. The moment he discovered Henry Calloway's past, something inside him shifted. This wasn't just a case of an old man down on his luck. This was a robbery, a slow, calculated theft that had stolen decades of a man's life, erased his legacy and left him fighting just to survive. Sitting in his home office, Shaq leaned forward, staring at the scattered papers and digital files pulled up on his screen. Everything pointed to one ugly truth. Henry hadn't just been fired, he had been buried. And Shaq was going to dig him back up. Shaq started making calls. He reached out to people he knew in academia, people who had spent years in university systems, people who still owed him favors. Some were reluctant to talk. Others had never even heard of Henry Calloway, which in itself was suspicious. How did a man who had written books, mentored students, and built an entire department just disappear? Then Shaq called an old journalist friend, Mitch Landry, a guy who had spent his career exposing corruption. "You ever heard of Henry Calloway?" Shaq asked, leaning back in his chair. There was silence on the other end, then a long sigh. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in a while." Shaq's grip on the phone tightened. "So you do know him?" "Oh, I knew of him," Mitch said. "Brilliant guy. Respected. And then one day, poof. Like he never existed." Shaq felt a knot in his stomach. "What happened?" Mitch hesitated, then lowered his voice. "He went up against the wrong people. The university, the donors, the whole system. He called them out for discrimination in hiring, for failing black faculty, for keeping funding out of black-led research. And let's just say, they made sure he paid the price." Shaq's jaw clenched. "You're telling me they fired him for speaking the truth?" "Worse," Mitch said. "They discredited him. They blacklisted him from getting work anywhere else. No school would touch him. He tried to fight it, but you know how these institutions work. Money talks, and they made sure his voice was drowned out." Shaq felt a slow burn in his chest. This wasn't just about Henry losing his job. This was about an entire system deciding a man was too dangerous because he refused to be silent. And now, decades later, Henry was paying for his defiance by pushing shopping carts in a grocery store parking lot. Shaq wasn't done. He needed proof. With Mitch's help, he tracked down old university records, archived articles, anything that mentioned Henry's work. What he found made his stomach turn. Henry had led one of the most successful history departments in the state. His students had gone on to prestigious careers. His research had influenced textbooks, and yet, there was barely a trace of him left in official records. His books? Out of print. His published papers? Buried under newer, rewritten versions that conveniently removed his contributions. His awards? Reassigned to other faculty. It was like the university had scrubbed his name from history. Shaq scrolled through old faculty lists. Professors who had come after Henry had taken credit for his work. His research, his projects, even the programs he had built. They were still thriving, but under someone else's name. Shaq pushed his laptop away, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just an injustice. This was a crime, and someone needed to answer for it. Shaq wasn't just going to sit back and be angry. He was going to confront the people who did this. He made a list of the key names involved in Henry's firing: the university board members, the department heads, the administrators. Some were retired, some had moved on to bigger positions, some were still right there, sitting in the same offices, living the comfortable lives they had stolen from Henry. One name stood out: Dr. Alan Whitmore, the former dean of the university, the man who had personally signed off on Henry's removal. Shaq didn't waste time. He found out where Whitmore worked now, a prestigious private university, earning 6 figures, still praised as an innovator in academia. Whitmore had built his career off of Henry's downfall. Shaq's hands curled into fists. Not anymore. Shaq had never been the kind of man to scheme in the shadows. He believed in walking right up to a problem and handling it head on. So that's exactly what he did. The next morning, Shaq walked straight into Alan Whitmore's office. No appointment, no warning. The secretary barely had time to react before Shaq was pushing the door open. Whitmore was sitting behind a massive oak desk, flipping through paperwork. He looked up, clearly irritated, until he realized who was standing in front of him. His expression faltered. Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq didn't sit. He didn't smile. He just folded his arms across his massive chest and stared the man down. "We need to talk about Henry Calloway." Whitmore blinked, his face unreadable. Then slowly, he set his pen down. "I was wondering when someone was going to bring him up again." Shaq narrowed his eyes. "So you admit it?" Whitmore sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Mr. O'Neal, I don't know what you think you know, but Henry Calloway's case was complicated." "No," Shaq said. "It was simple. You destroyed a man's career because he wouldn't keep quiet. You took everything from him. And now, you're sitting here like it never happened." Whitmore exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Look, I won't deny that Henry was a brilliant academic, but he made enemies, and the university covered its ass," Shaq interrupted. "And you helped them do it." Whitmore didn't respond. He didn't have to. The guilt was all over his face. Shaq leaned forward. "You're going to fix this." Whitmore scoffed. "And how exactly do you suggest I do that?" Shaq didn't break eye contact. "You're going to reinstate his name. Put him back in the records. Acknowledge his work. Restore his legacy." Whitmore stared at him for a long moment, then let out a small chuckle. "And if I don't?" Shaq smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Then I make sure everyone knows exactly what you did. And I promise you, the world listens when I talk." Whitmore's smirk faded. Shaq let the silence hang for a moment, then stood up. "I'll give you 48 hours to make the right decision." He turned to leave. "After that, I go public." As he walked out of the office, he didn't have to look back to know Whitmore was already sweating. Shaq had started this journey thinking he was just helping an old man who had fallen on hard times. Now, he realized he was fighting for something bigger. Henry Calloway's story wasn't just about one man. It was about every person who had been silenced, every voice that had been erased because it was inconvenient. Shaq wasn't just going to fix what had been done. He was going to make sure it never happened again. Shaq had faced a lot of challenges in his life. Defending in the paint against the toughest players, building his business empire, handling media storms, but somehow, this felt harder. It wasn't just about helping Henry. It was about doing it the right way. He had confronted Alan Whitmore and put pressure on the university to restore Henry's name. But that was a battle still unfolding, and in the meantime, Henry was still out there pushing carts, still struggling to afford basic necessities. Shaq wasn't about to let that slide. So he did what any man in his position would do. He made a plan. Shaq was a problem solver. If there was an issue, he fixed it. And Henry's biggest issue? Money. It wasn't hard for Shaq to track down Henry's unpaid bills. Overdue rent notices, medical bills piling up, an old credit debt that had been following him for years. It was all there, and it was all fixable. So Shaq handled it. Silently. Discreetly. He didn't want Henry to feel like a charity case. So he worked behind the scenes. He made a call to the landlord, had the past due rent covered for the next year. He contacted the medical office, wiped out the outstanding balance. He found the credit agency, settled the debt in full. Within a few hours, Henry Calloway was at least financially free. Shaq leaned back in his chair, feeling a small sense of relief. This was the right thing to do. He wasn't giving Henry a handout, he was just removing obstacles, making it easier for him to breathe. But he underestimated one thing: Henry's pride. The next morning, Shaq returned to the grocery store, expecting to see Henry going about his usual routine. Maybe looking a little lighter, maybe standing a little taller now that his burdens had been lifted. Instead, he found a storm brewing in the old man's eyes. Henry was standing by the cart bay, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The moment he saw Shaq, he waved him over. Shaq knew something was off immediately. There was tension in Henry's shoulders, a sharpness in his stare that hadn't been there before. "Morning," Shaq said, keeping his tone casual. "Cut the crap, O'Neal," Henry snapped. "You think I wouldn't find out?" Shaq's stomach dropped. Henry took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You paid off my debts. My landlord came by this morning, grinning like a damn fool. Said some anonymous donor took care of everything." Shaq exhaled slowly. "I was just trying to help, big man." "Help?" Henry scoffed. "You think throwing money at my problems makes them go away?" Shaq frowned. "Henry, this isn't about charity. It's about making sure you're not out here breaking your back just to survive." Henry's hands curled into fists, not in aggression, but in frustration. "You don't get it, do you?" He took a breath, trying to steady himself. "I ain't never taken handouts. Not once. You don't know what it's like to work your whole life, to fight for every damn thing, only to have someone come along and act like you can't handle your own business." Shaq felt a pang of guilt. He had thought he was doing the right thing. But looking at Henry now, he realized he had gone about it all wrong. "I wasn't trying to insult you," Shaq said carefully. "Maybe not," Henry muttered. "But that's what it feels like." Shaq had spent his life giving back, donating, funding charities, setting up scholarships. He believed in using his success to lift others up. But Henry wasn't like the people Shaq had helped before. He wasn't some kid trying to get through school. He wasn't a struggling young athlete, looking for a break. Henry was a man who had already built his life. He had earned his respect, his dignity, and the system had ripped it away from him. Now here Shaq was, trying to fix things with money. But Henry didn't want to fix. He wanted what had been stolen from him. Shaq let out a slow breath. "All right, Henry, I hear you." Henry studied him, as if deciding whether to believe him. Finally, he gave a small nod.
"Good. Because I don't need saving, Shaq."
Shaq nodded back. "I get that now." And for the first time since they met, Shaq wasn't thinking about how to solve Henry's problems. He was thinking about how to make things right in a way that actually mattered. This wasn't about money. This was about justice. And Shaq wasn't done fighting yet. Shaq had promised Henry he wouldn't interfere again. At least not in a way that made him feel small. He meant it. But fate had a way of flipping things upside down, and this time Shaq wasn't the one pulling the strings. It started with a single video. Shaq had returned to the grocery store a few days after his confrontation with Henry, keeping his distance, watching from his SUV. He still hadn't figured out his next move, but he wasn't ready to walk away. As he sat there, his phone buzzed. A text from a friend. "Man, have you seen this?" Attached was a link to a viral social media post. Shaq clicked on it. The video loaded, and his stomach dropped. It was Henry. The footage was grainy, clearly taken on a phone. It showed Henry in his worn-out jacket, struggling to push a line of heavy carts up the sloped entryway of the store. The wind blew against him, making the task even harder. The way he hunched, the way he clenched his jaw in determination, it was heartbreaking. The caption beneath the video read, "This is what America does to its elders." A 90-year-old man, forced to work to survive. Where's the justice? Shaq scrolled through the comments. His chest tightened. This is disgusting. No one should be working at that age. Somebody find this man. We need to help him. Where is his family? The system is broken. The video had already racked up millions of views. News outlets were picking it up. People were demanding answers. And worst of all, Henry had no idea. By the time Shaq arrived at the store, reporters were already gathering outside. Microphones, cameras, a frenzy of voices shouting questions. Henry wasn't on shift yet, and Shaq knew he had to get to him first. He drove straight to Henry's apartment, parked outside, and knocked on the door. No answer. Shaq knocked again, louder. Henry, it's me. Open up. Footsteps. A pause. Then the door creaked open just enough for Shaq to see Henry's face. His tired, furious, betrayed face. You did this, Henry said, his voice like gravel. Shaq's stomach sank. Henry, I swear I didn't leak that video. Henry's eyes didn't soften. Then who did? Shaq hesitated. He didn't have an answer. Henry scoffed. Doesn't matter. It's out now. Inside Henry's apartment, the TV was on. News anchors were already spinning his life into a headline. His face was plastered across every major network. The heartbreaking story of a former professor erased by the system. The tragic reality of America's forgotten elders. Shaq sat on the worn-out couch while Henry paced, running a hand over his bald head. I don't want this, Henry muttered. I don't need people feeling sorry for me. Shaq sighed. They're not just feeling sorry, Henry. They're angry. They want to help. Henry turned, eyes blazing. And what happens when they forget? Huh? When the next sad story comes along, I'll still be here, still fighting to survive. Shaq had no response to that. Because Henry was right. As the media storm raged on, something unexpected happened. People started digging into Henry's past. Journalists uncovered the documents proving he had been pushed out of the university. Old colleagues, former students, they started speaking up. Henry Calloway was one of the best professors I ever had. They destroyed his career because he refused to be silent. The university owes this man more than an apology. Shaq watched it unfold in real time. The world wasn't just outraged about Henry pushing carts. They were outraged about what had been done to him decades ago. And now, the university was under fire. Shaq returned to Henry's apartment later that night. The old man sat in his recliner, staring at the TV, watching as a news anchor recounted his own life back to him. Shaq sat down across from him. You've got the world's attention, Henry. What do you want to do with it? Henry let out a slow breath. His shoulders sagged. I just wanted to be left alone. A long silence stretched between them. Then, for the first time, Henry looked tired. Not just physically, but in his... But maybe that's not an option anymore. Shaq leaned forward. Maybe not. But that doesn't mean we can't make things right. Henry's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was something other than anger in them. There was possibility, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of hope. The media storm wasn't slowing down. Everywhere Shaq looked, news headlines, talk shows, social media, Henry Calloway's name was finally being spoken again. But not everyone was happy about it. Shaq had seen this before. When the truth comes out, the people who built their lives on lies start scrambling. And someone was scrambling now. It started with a phone call. Shaq was in his office, reviewing the latest articles about Henry's case, when his assistant buzzed in. There's someone on the line you might want to hear from. Says it's about Henry Calloway. Shaq put the call on speaker. This is Shaq. A smooth, practiced voice came through. Mr. O'Neal, this is Lawrence Davenport. I believe we have a situation. Shaq recognized the name immediately. Dr. Lawrence Davenport, former university chancellor, now a high-profile consultant in academia. A man who had spent decades profiting from the system. Henry had tried to change. And what situation would that be? Shaq asked, his voice level. Davenport sighed. You've stirred up something dangerous. We both know Calloway's history is complicated. The university has no interest in rehashing old wounds. Shaq's jaw tightened. Old wounds? You mean the injustice that stole a man's life? Davenport ignored the jab. Let's be reasonable. What's done is done. No need to drag institutions through the mud for something that happened decades ago. Shaq leaned forward. So that's why you're calling? To tell me to let it go? A beat of silence. Then Davenport's tone changed. cooler, more threatening. I'm calling to tell you that any further accusations against the university or its former leadership could result in legal consequences. We have powerful allies, Mr. O'Neal. You don't want to be on the wrong side of this. Shaq let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the edge of his desk. He had expected resistance, but he hadn't expected outright threats. Shaq wasn't the type to be intimidated. If Davenport thought he could scare him off, he had picked the wrong guy. Shaq started digging deep, and what he found made his blood boil. Davenport wasn't just a man trying to protect the university's reputation. He was one of the key figures responsible for erasing Henry's legacy. Old faculty records showed that after Henry had been forced out, Davenport had taken control of his research. He had published Henry's unfinished work under his own name, claimed credit for years of historical analysis, and used it to climb the academic ladder. And now he sat in a luxury office, built on a foundation of stolen knowledge. Shaq wasn't going to let that slide. Shaq didn't bother with phone calls this time. He showed up at Davenport's office unannounced. The receptionist barely had time to react before Shaq was walking past her desk, pushing open the glass doors to the executive suite. Davenport sat behind a massive desk, a wall of awards and honorary degrees behind him. A man who had crafted an image of power and respect. When he saw Shaq, his expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of unease. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Davenport said smoothly. "I assume you're here to waste more of my time?" Shaq closed the door behind him. "You stole Henry Calloway's work." Davenport smiled, the kind of smile meant to infuriate. "Those are dangerous accusations. They're facts." Shaq placed a folder on the desk. "Proof. Documents, records, dates. Everything linking you to the theft of Henry's research." Davenport didn't even glance at the folder. He simply exhaled and sat back. "You think you can walk in here and demand justice like it's that simple?" Shaq's eyes narrowed. "I think you can either do the right thing, or I'll make sure the whole world knows exactly what you did." Davenport chuckled. "You don't scare me, O'Neal. You think a viral news cycle can undo decades of influence? You don't understand how this game works." Shaq leaned down, placing his hands on the desk, towering over the man. "Then explain it to me." Davenport's smile thinned. "You can't win." Shaq held his gaze. "Watch me." Shaq knew brute force wouldn't work here. Davenport had money, connections, lawyers. He had spent years covering his tracks. Shaq needed a smarter plan. He reached out to Mitch Landry, the journalist who had first helped him uncover Henry's past. "I need a full expose on Davenport," Shaq told him. "The stolen research, the cover-ups, everything." Mitch was already on it. Within 48 hours, news outlets had picked up the story. The dark history of academia, how a respected chancellor stole a professor's work and built a career on lies. Shaquille O'Neal calls out corruption in higher education. The pressure was mounting. Davenport was no longer in control of the narrative. And then came the final blow. Shaq received an unexpected call from the university's current leadership. The new president wanted to meet. They had seen the backlash, the evidence, the growing public outrage. "We're prepared to make things right," the president admitted, "but we need your help." Shaq didn't hesitate. "Then let's fix this the right way." Davenport had spent years thinking he was untouchable. But now, he was running out of places to hide. Shaq had started this fight thinking he was just helping an old man get back on his feet. Now he was tearing down an entire system of corruption. Henry Calloway's name would be restored. His work would be returned to him. And the man who stole his life would finally face the consequences. But this wasn't over yet. The biggest battle was still ahead. The storm hadn't settled. Henry's name was everywhere now. The forgotten professor, the man erased by a corrupt system, the symbol of injustice that America couldn't ignore. The university was scrambling to save face. The media was still buzzing with the scandal. And Davenport? He had gone quiet. But Shaq knew a man like that wasn't going down without a fight. Something had to happen. Something big. Shaq had an idea Henry probably wasn't going to like. Shaq pulled up to Henry's apartment that evening, 2 large bags of takeout in hand. He knew better than to show up empty-handed. Henry was more open to conversation when he was eating. When Henry answered the door, his eyes were tired, his shoulders heavy. He had been carrying this weight for decades. Now that the world finally knew his story, it was like he didn't know what to do with himself. "Smells good," Henry muttered, eyeing the bags as Shaq stepped inside. "Figured you might be hungry," Shaq said, setting the food on the table. and figured you might want to hear what I got planned. Henry sighed, rubbing his forehead. Shaq, if this is about money again. It's not, Shaq interrupted. It's about legacy. Henry's brow furrowed. Legacy? Shaq sat down, leaning forward. You fought your whole life for the truth. They tried to erase you, Henry, and they almost got away with it. But now the world is listening, and we need to make sure they never forget again. Henry sat down across from him, wary. And how exactly do we do that? Shaq took a breath. A public event. In your honor. Henry froze, staring at him like he had just spoken a foreign language. Excuse me? Shaq kept his voice steady. A night dedicated to you. The university is under pressure. They're willing to do something big to clean up their mess, so I say we use that to our advantage. Henry scoffed, shaking his head. So they humiliate me in public, and then throw me a party to make themselves feel better? No thank you. Shaq expected that reaction. Henry, this isn't for them. It's for you. It's for your students. It's for every person who's ever been silenced like you were. Henry's jaw clenched. He wanted to fight it. He didn't like being the center of attention, didn't want to be paraded around like a victim. Shaq saw the hesitation in his eyes, so he pushed a little harder. They buried your name, he said quietly. Now we put it back where it belongs. Henry didn't answer right away. He took his time eating in silence, his mind far away. Shaq didn't rush him. Finally, after a long stretch of quiet, Henry sighed. And what exactly does this event look like? Shaq smirked. A tribute to your work. A full public recognition of what was stolen from you. A chance for your students, your colleagues, hell, the whole world to hear your side of the story. Henry shook his head. Sounds like a damn circus. Sounds like justice. Shaq corrected. Sounds like the moment they have to look you in the eye and admit what they did. Henry exhaled slowly. He had spent years being ignored. Now he had the chance to be heard. But did he want it? He tapped his fingers on the table. His voice was softer when he spoke. I don't want pity, Shaq. Shaq nodded. Then don't ask for it. Demand respect instead. For the first time, Henry didn't shut the idea down. He didn't say yes. But he didn't say no either. The next morning, Shaq made the call. The university had been waiting for him to reach out. They needed a way to fix their reputation, and even though they were guilty as hell, Shaq was willing to use their desperation to get Henry what he deserved. Here's how this is gonna go. Shaq told the university president. You're gonna give Henry a night to reclaim his name. You're gonna acknowledge your mistake, reinstate his contributions, and make sure his legacy is recognized for generations to come. The president hesitated. We would have to coordinate with no red tape, Shaq cut in. No PR spin. This isn't a university event. This is Henry's event. And you're just lucky I'm letting you be involved. After a long silence, the president sighed. Fine. We'll do it your way. Shaq knew they weren't doing this out of the kindness of their hearts. They were doing it because they were scared. Good. Let them be scared. 2 days later, Shaq was back at Henry's apartment. Henry answered the door with his usual skeptical expression. What? Shaq grinned. It's happening. Henry rolled his eyes. Damn it, Shaq. Shaq chuckled. Come on, man. You knew I wasn't letting this go. Henry sighed, stepping back to let Shaq in. He walked to the window, staring out at the street below, his fingers tapping against the windowsill. It's real now, Henry murmured. No turning back. Shaq crossed his arms. You scared? Henry let out a rough laugh. Terrified. Shaq nodded. Good. That means it's worth doing. Henry turned, studying him for a long moment. Then finally, he nodded. All right, big man. Let's do this. And just like that, the fight was no longer just Shaq's. It was Henry's too. Even as they moved forward, there was tension in the air. Would the event actually make a difference? Would the university follow through on their promises? Would Henry regret saying yes? Shaq knew there were still obstacles ahead. People like Davenport didn't go down without a fight. And Shaq had a feeling this war wasn't over yet. The night had arrived. The auditorium was packed. Students, professors, journalists, activists, even some of the same university board members who had once buried Henry's name. Cameras lined the back of the room. News crews prepared to broadcast the event live. Shaq stood near the entrance, watching as people took their seats, whispering to each other. There was a buzz in the air, an electricity that only came when something bigger than a speech was about to happen. Tonight wasn't just about honoring Henry Callaway. It was about setting the record straight. But Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When Henry stepped onto the stage, the entire room rose to their feet. A standing ovation. Shaq saw Henry hesitate for just a second, his eyes scanning the crowd, as if trying to convince himself that this was real. Then he took a deep breath, stepped up to the podium, and faced the world. "I never thought I'd be standing here." His voice was steady, but there was a weight to it. "I never thought I'd hear my name spoken with respect again." The crowd went silent, hanging on to every word. Henry told his story, not just about the betrayal, but about the cost of speaking up. How fighting for justice had left him jobless, penniless, forgotten. Shaq watched as people in the audience wiped their eyes, some shaking their heads in disbelief. "But I don't stand here today as a man who was erased," Henry continued. "I stand here as proof that the truth can never be fully buried." The room erupted into applause. For the first time in decades, Henry Calloway's name was spoken with honor. Then came the moment Shaq had been waiting for. The university president stepped onto the stage, clearing his throat. He had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. "We failed Henry Calloway. This institution took part in a system that silenced voices it found inconvenient, and for that, we take full responsibility." Shaq narrowed his eyes. The words sounded rehearsed. The man didn't look nearly as remorseful as he should have. Then the president turned to Henry. "To right this wrong, we are officially reinstating your position as Professor Emeritus. Your research will be properly credited, and your contributions will be honored within these walls." The audience applauded again, but Shaq didn't clap. He had spent enough time around powerful men to recognize when someone was trying to control a narrative. They weren't doing this because it was right. They were doing it because they were afraid. And if they were afraid, it meant they were still hiding something. As the event wrapped up, Henry was surrounded by students and old colleagues, shaking hands, smiling for cameras. He was exhausted, but he was happy. Shaq, however, was watching the back of the room. That's when he saw him, Lawrence Davenport, the man who had stolen Henry's work. The man who had tried to silence Shaq when he started digging. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't clapping. He was watching, calculating. Then, as if he could sense Shaq's gaze, he turned and walked out the door. Shaq clenched his jaw. This wasn't over. Shaq was about to follow Davenport when he heard it. A sharp gasp from the crowd, then a sudden rush of movement. He turned just in time to see Henry's body crumple to the ground. For a second, time froze. Then, chaos. People rushed forward, voices overlapping. Someone shouted for a doctor. Someone else called an ambulance. Shaq was at Henry's side in seconds, dropping to his knees. "Henry, hey, stay with me, big man." Henry's eyes fluttered open, his breath shallow. He gave Shaq the smallest of smirks. "Damn, wasn't planning on going out like this." Shaq forced a laugh, even as fear gripped his chest. "Yeah, well, you're not going anywhere. Not tonight." But deep down he knew. Henry had spent his whole life fighting, and sometimes even the strongest fighters run out of time. The hospital waiting room was too quiet. Shaq sat with his head in his hands, replaying everything in his mind. The speech, the recognition, the way Henry had finally felt seen, and then the way he had collapsed. A doctor eventually walked in, his expression unreadable. He's stable, but his body's taken a toll. Years of stress, exhaustion. It's all catching up. Shaq exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening, but only slightly. The doctor continued. "He needs rest. He can't keep living the way he has been." Shaq nodded. "I got him. Whatever he needs, I got him." The doctor gave him a small smile. "Good. Because right now, Henry Calloway needs more than justice. He needs peace." The next morning, the news was everywhere. Henry Calloway finally gets justice, but at what cost? Former professor collapses after emotional tribute. Will he recover? The world had rallied for Henry, but was it too late? Shaq stood outside the hospital room, watching through the window as Henry lay in bed, his breathing steady but weak. He had fought so hard for this man, and now he wondered if the fight had taken too much out of him. But as he stood there lost in thought, Henry stirred. His eyes opened slightly, finding Shaq's through the glass. And despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the pain, he smiled. Because no matter what happened next, he had finally won. Shaq had spent his life achieving the impossible, winning championships, building businesses, making an impact far beyond basketball. But this wasn't about trophies or money. This was about doing what was right. Henry Calloway had fought against a system that tried to erase him, and now Shaq was going to make sure his name lived forever. It started with a conversation. Shaq sat across from Henry in the hospital room, the old man looking frail but stubborn as ever. His color had returned, but the exhaustion lingered. Decades of stress couldn't be undone overnight.
Doctors say you need to take it easy, Shaq said, arms crossed.
Henry huffed. They say a lot of things. I ain't dead yet. Shaq smirked, then leaned forward. Good, because I need you to be around for what comes next. Henry's brows furrowed. What now, big man? Shaq hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. Henry eyed it suspiciously, before flipping it open. His hands, the same hands that once held books, wrote lessons, shaped young minds, froze mid-turn. His breath caught. What is this? Shaq leaned back. That's the deed to the university's history department. Well, it was, until I bought it. Henry blinked. You what? Shaq chuckled. I bought the damn building, Henry. Silence stretched between them. Henry glanced back at the papers, reading the fine print, as if his eyes were playing tricks on him. You mean to tell me you bought the same university that threw me out? Shaq grinned. Not the whole thing, just the part that matters. The university had been desperate to clean up its reputation after the scandal. Shaq had given them a way out, but on his terms. He bought the history department building outright, stripping it from their control. The place where Henry had once taught, the halls that had once carried his voice, they now belonged to him. And it wasn't just a name change. The building was being transformed into the Henry Calloway Center for History and Justice, a place dedicated to truth, education, and exposing the very injustices Henry had spent his life fighting. It would fund research for underrepresented scholars, provide scholarships to students who wanted to challenge history's narrative, and ensure that what happened to Henry never happened again. Shaq had turned Henry's greatest loss into his greatest victory. Henry sat in stunned silence, the folder still clutched in his hands. He had spent years believing his fight had been for nothing, and now he was looking at proof that he had won. His throat tightened. You didn't have to do this. Shaq shrugged. Yeah, I did. Henry shook his head, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. Shaq smirked. Then don't say anything. Just be there when we cut the ribbon. Henry let out a shaky laugh, wiping at his eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. As the emotions settled, Henry closed the folder, studying Shaq with a look that was hard to read. Then he said something that caught Shaq off guard. You remind me of someone. Shaq raised a brow. That's... Henry nodded. My son. A weight settled in the room. Shaq had never asked about Henry's family, not after their first conversation. Henry exhaled, staring at his hands. I told you before, I haven't seen him in over 20 years. But what I didn't tell you is why. Shaq sat up straighter, sensing something heavy coming. His name was Elijah, Henry continued, voice softer now. Smart kid, stubborn like me. But life took us in different directions. We had a falling out. I always thought I'd get the chance to make it right. But then one day he was gone. Died in a car accident. Shaq felt a sharp pang in his chest. I never got to say goodbye, Henry murmured. Never got to tell him I was proud of him. Never got to fix what was broken. The old man looked up, his eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude. Recognition. Then you showed up. Shaq didn't speak. He just let Henry's words sink in. I don't know if you believe in fate, Henry said. But I do. And I think maybe, just maybe, my boy sent you to me. Shaq swallowed, feeling an unexpected lump in his throat. This had never been just about justice. It had been about something bigger, something neither of them had expected. Family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about who showed up when no one else did. And in that moment, Shaq knew Henry wasn't just a man he had helped. He was family now. A month later, the Henry Calloway Center for History and Justice opened its doors. Shaq stood beside Henry as they cut the ribbon, the crowd cheering. Students, teachers, activists, reporters, everyone who had followed the story was there. Davenport was nowhere to be seen. His power had crumbled, just like the lie he had built his career on. As the ceremony wrapped up, Henry turned to Shaq, shaking his head with a smile. You really don't do things halfway, do you? Shaq grinned. Not my style. Henry chuckled, but there was something else in his eyes now. Peace. For the first time in decades, Henry Calloway wasn't fighting to be remembered. He was history now, and no one could erase him again. How many Henry Callaways are out there forgotten, erased, unseen? Injustice thrives in silence. But stories like this prove one thing: the truth always finds its way back. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Keep asking questions. Keep seeing the people the world ignores. Because sometimes, one moment of awareness can rewrite history. Who else needs to hear this? Share it. Speak on it. Because justice starts with those who refuse to look away.